Well, hi, my name is Bob Haycock, and I'm going to be talking to you about choughs in the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park. I'm just a member of a very small team involving myself and my wife Annie, and very importantly, Jane Hodges, who some of you may know, who was the National Park ecologist. She covers a huge chunk of Pembrokeshire from the mid and to the north of the county, and also with the islands and the island staff who contribute a fantastic amount of information to our understanding of choughs in the county. Here it is, our chough, the red-billed chough, or we'll just call it a chough, and it's got that lovely down-curved red bill, red legs, beautiful glossy black plumage. This is what greets you when you come to the Pembrokeshire coast. What a wonderful sound. Perhaps we should be calling it chow rather than chuff. Chuff doesn't seem quite the right name, but anyway, chuff is the bird. Corvids generally are fairly common on the coast, and one species which sometimes you can confuse with choughs are the jackdaws. Jackdaws are a similar sized bird, although it doesn't have the same characteristics, red bill, red legs of the chough. But nevertheless, when they're flying, they can be mistaken occasionally, and they do have quite a high pitched, somewhat chough sounding call, and especially the young ones were in the nest. So it's one to be aware of. And there are generally many more jackdaws on the coast than there are choughs. Well, here in the photograph, we can have a silhouette of a chough overhead, and you can see immediately it's got relatively broad wings, and those finger-like projections on the primary feathers are very characteristic. Jackdaws, on the other hand, slightly narrower wings, and those finger-like projections are not so obvious. But having said that, when a chough is flying low over the sea, or maybe parallel to the cliff, you may not see those broad wings or appreciate them in quite the same way. However, when you see a flock, particularly flying over, they undulate, they're very buoyant, up and down, flying around, almost like if they were on a yo-yo. They seem to just enjoy flying in the strong wind. So let's have a look at the distribution of choughs in the world. You can see that in Asia they're relatively widespread, it would appear, from the Himalayas into China and Tibet. But then as you go west, they tend to thin out, and they're not the populations are not so strong and very scattered. Quite a reasonable number in Spain and down into North Africa and as far as the Canary Islands. But then if you go further north into France, they're very thinly spread in Brittany. And then you can look at the situation in the UK and Ireland, where we seem to be quite near the northern edge of the range, but very, very much on the western side only. If we look more closely at its European distribution, this is from the European Breeding Birds Atlas number 2, which was published 2 or 3 years ago. You can see that its distribution is pretty scattered, mostly in sort of southern Europe. Not very many in Italy, more numerous in Spain, but possibly a little bit scattered. And then there's a small population in Brittany on the French coast. By the time you get to the United Kingdom and Ireland, you can see that it's very much on the western side, more in Ireland, I suppose, and it kind of peters out when you get to Scotland around the Hebrides. But yeah, they're not. So it's a very scattered distribution. If we look at the status of the chough, it's clearly not a very common bird in Britain, and in Europe it's amber listed because of its unfavourable conservation status. And it's very much limited, certainly in Western Europe, to the western seaboard. on the distribution in the UK and Ireland. And you can see straight away that it is very much a westerly species. It likes these remote cliffs, these Atlantic cliffs on the Atlantic Ocean side. Very numerous in southwest Ireland, pretty numerous in Wales around our coast, and in the Isle of Man in particular. Petering out when you get to the Inner Hebrides around Islay and Jura. And there's a tiny population in Cornwall, which has expanded in recent years from its arrival there, having become extinct in the past. It used to be more numerous along the south coast of England, from basically Cornwall to Kent and possibly up into eastern England too, but we don't have much knowledge about that. And maybe they'll reappear again there sometime in the future.
Well, before we home in on the Pembrokeshire chough situation, perhaps we should have a little look at chough's social behaviour because it is quite an interesting bird, very sociable, and they form flocks when they're quite young, but when they are breeding age, they mate for life, pairs will mate for life, and they can live for 10 years or more. Some we know can live more than 20 years, and this has been found out from ringing them. They become sexually mature when they're about 2 years old, but breeding success is much more likely when they're about 3 years old, and it starts to improve from then on. Adult pairs occupy territory, though occasionally they'll join these mobile flocks of younger non-breeding birds, which can be very boisterous when you see them in the spring. These flocks appear mainly on the coast. It could be maybe small 5 or 6 birds up to maybe 30 or 40 birds at a time. And these are moving around the coast looking for food, looking for places to roost. And it's the hub of the Chough society, I guess. These flocks are so important to communicate information about where there are best food, best breeding places, best places to roost, and so on. So it's a very important part of the Chough life to be in these social groups. Here in these two sort of photographs of a flock up in North Pembrokeshire, we have a typical social gathering of young choughs in the autumn. They've come together to feed in this field here, and it all looked very sensible and calm at the beginning, but there's a lot of blood flowing in these birds. It's a time of the year in the autumn when young birds are trying to become dominant over their rivals, the males in particular, and they're also trying to pair up. And it's important to have as many choughs together in these sort of groups as possible because it does help the selection and pair bonding occurs at this time. But they can occasionally start to fight with these so-called parliaments occur around about September time, especially. It seems to be the time that, and it happens in magpies and other corvids as well. But it's a very boisterous affair.
Here we have two males fighting. In this case, it was in the spring, which is a bit unusual. We suspect that the dominant, the slightly larger male in this case, was establishing a territory, and suddenly this other younger, probably younger male, smaller bird, came in, hopefully also to try to take over territory. So it resulted in a bit of a fight. And as you can see, the larger bird has pinned the other one to the ground, stabbing it. Pretty horrific, really. Eventually, they both flew off, and we don't really know what actually happened. But in any case, the territory in this particular year failed, and so neither of them prospered from it. When pairs are eventually formed, as I say, they will mate for life. But in the breeding season, in the case of breeding, it's the female that does the incubation, and she broods the small chicks. And during that period, she's very reliant on the male to find sufficient sources of food, and he'll either take food to her and feed her at the nest, or she'll come out and feed on the cliff top from time to time, and he will feed her or take her to a good source of food. And so that pair bond is so important if that pair is going to succeed to rear young. In poor years, when there's less food around and the male can't possibly provide it, there are sometimes problems and the females get weaker, and we know that in some cases they fail because of that. When they do have young in the nest, of course, and the young are growing, both male and female will feed the young. But in that early part of the season, that bond between male and female is so important. if they're going to have a successful season. And on the subject of chough feeding or chough food, Uh, this picture here shows two choughs feeding in typical coastal habitat where there's been a slight slump in the soil. It's fairly short turf, which they really do like to feed in. Less than 2 centimeters is we tend to think. But the important thing is the interface between vegetation and bare ground, or between bare ground and rocky terrain. These are really important little zones for choughs to feed in. They find a lot of food in those sort of places. But also they'll feed in pasture, typically semi-natural grasslands or heath on occasion, and dune grasslands also very important for them because these are all rich in soil invertebrates. They will also feed in improved grassland or even in cereal stubbles, feeding on seeds, spilt grain, etc., particularly in the sort of autumn period. So they do have a variety of requirements. Well, here out in the open is a chough feeding in short turf, and he's been probing into the grassland there to pick up a small, looks like a leather jacket, a cranefly larvae. In the spring especially, and especially if you have a damp spring, cranefly larvae can be abundant, and also beetle larvae too. These are very, very important food sources for choughs, particularly at the beginning of the breeding season. And if they get plenty of those, put on good weight, there's a fair chance it'll be a fairly good breeding season. But in dry springs, when these things are scarce, it tends to be a poorer season. Another food source which is incredibly important to choughs are ants and their eggs, larval stages. But they occur widely in the grassland areas, particularly in the semi-natural grassland areas or on the coast. Here on the limestone, there are loads, there are hundreds of these anthills of the yellow ant, and you can see on the left of this picture that choughs have been hacking into that to take larvae or eggs, most likely. And they do this in sort of late May and into early June at a time when the young are about to fledge. So it's an easy source of food, and it's something that they can introduce the young ones to when they do fledge, where their bills are very soft and they can get into these anthills and find a reasonably good source of food to get them started. Now here we can see a chough poking into the side of a small sort of sandy, soily cliff on the coast. This is also on the limestone. And what this bird is doing, it's almost certainly pecking around looking for ants or Hymenoptera, possibly crustaceans, maybe some woodlice. But these eroding bits of cliff are, well, soil and cliff are really, really important for these birds. They're rich in invertebrate species, and just underneath the roots of grasses and things, they find quite a lot of their food that way. Well as probing into the ground with that sharp down-curved beak, choughs are also pretty good at catching insects on the wing, or that they're crawling around on the surface. Here, an adult chough is just outside a small colony of mining bees, and he's waiting for the bees to emerge from little holes in the soil there. And year, particularly in the autumn and in the winter period, if there are any good stubble fields around with spilt grain, this will often attract flocks of choughs. These are mainly young birds that are moving around the coast looking for somewhere to feed and to roost. So yes, these are quite valuable places. They're quite open, the soils are quite open, so it's a good source of food in the autumn. As well as being able to probe into the soil for invertebrate food, they also have the ability to listen for their prey. They haven't got any visual clues, and possibly this occurs when food prey is a little bit scarce and they have to make a bigger effort to look for it and find it. So they'll literally put their ear to the ground and listen to what's moving around in the soil. And when they found a good spot, they will then probe and remove the invertebrates from the turf. So where do our choughs breed along the Pembrokeshire coast? Well, they tend to like fairly large crevices. Jackdaws can squeeze into quite small holes and cracks and seem to favour lots of different places. And also, of course, they are in buildings too. But on the coast, our choughs seem to like the larger crevices, which they favour very much. And here is a bird just leaving one such crevice. Once they've established a nest site and built a nest in the spring, they will lay a clutch of eggs. 3 to 5 is typical. 5 perhaps for the more mature birds in better sites, and 3 or even less, sometimes just 1 for those young pairs starting to breed for the first time. But incubation is a relatively short period of 17 to 18 days. Well, when you compare that with a blackbird, for example, that can incubate for about 13, 14 days, that seems to be a rather short period for a medium-sized corvid. But nevertheless, they seem that's what they do. However, the young staying in the nest quite a long time. 5 to 6 weeks is kind of typical. This youngster here is probably about 4 weeks old, and it's already starting to explore the outside world a little bit, but it will not leave the security of that crevice, that nest site in that area for at least another couple of weeks. But after 5 or 6 weeks, the young will eventually come out of the nest site. The adults will lure them away from that site. It's a bit of a dangerous time, of course, vulnerable, especially on stormy weather. We know that some chicks don't make it, but those that do will go immediately to nearby crevices that the adults have found for them to hide in, and they'll spend another few days, maybe 4 or 5 days, simply hiding in another place near the nest site, so they'll not be allowed to venture out onto the cliff top until the adults think they're ready to do that. And of course, they're very vulnerable at this stage to predators like ravens or peregrines, or even ground predators for that matter. So it's essential that they can understand the outside world better, and are strong enough to come out onto the top with their parents when they're ready to do so. And yes, it's now mid-June, and the young are starting to fledge. And this is what you hear as you walk along the cliff tops. And this is what we want to see: broods of young out on the cliff, being fed noisily, desperately needing food, crying all the time, "Feed me, feed me." But it's a good sign that they've at least managed to get out of the nest and survive so far. What do we know about choughs in Pembrokeshire in the past? Well, an important reference was that made by the Reverend Murray Matthew back in 1894 in his first avied fauna for the county birds of Pembrokeshire. And he reckoned they were common all the way around the coast from Tenby to Dinas between 1840 and 1850. And he said they were nesting in the ruins of Bishop's Palace at St David's, and also in abundance at Manorbier Castle, in the sort of mid 19th century. They're not breeding in those places today. Um, but he was also getting concerned at the end of the 19th century that their numbers were declining, and he kind of blamed egg collecting perhaps as the major problem at that time. But if it wasn't for the fact that some of these birds were in difficult places, their demise would have been more serious. It's rather ironic, though, because if you read his book, it's quite clear that he himself was an egg collector, as were some of his fellow clergyman friends. And yet, obviously, he presumably assumed what he was doing was okay. Anyway, he was he was rather concerned about egg collecting at that time, so we don't know how much of a part he played in that problem. In the early part of the 20th century, Lockley, who wrote the book Birds of Pembrokeshire, published in 1949, he thought the numbers were relatively modest, and they'd been around about 30 to 36 pairs for around about 50 years in the early part of the 20th century, and in 1948 estimated about 35 pairs in the county of Pembrokeshire. And then when we get to the early 1960s, Rolfe, who did the first national chough population survey, well, he recorded a rather similar number to the numbers that Lockley was suggesting. And but we know that his survey was incomplete. It probably didn't cover the islands particularly well, and certainly within Wales and within Pembrokeshire in particular, it was probably not a complete survey. And also, sadly, it followed the 1962-63 very harsh winter when it's very likely a lot of the choughs would have perished in that period. So several years later, Jack Donovan in 1971 set about doing a repeat county survey for Pembrokeshire. Now, Jack Donovan, some of you may know, he was the county recorder at the time, very strong connections with the islands, of course, over the years. And but he recorded 46 pairs. We don't know whether that was because it was a better covered survey. Probably that helped, but it's also likely that the population had recovered a bit since that horrible cold 62-63 winter period.
Well, Chough has been subject to decadal surveys quite some time, since 1963, roughly speaking, decadal surveys, that is, for the whole country. And you can see from this that from 1963 onwards, numbers have been increasing somewhat. We're now up from about 800 and something pairs to over 1,000, 1,400 pairs now, including Southern Ireland, where there's a much larger population. But out of this, these population estimates, Wales is certainly the most important in the UK. In 2014, we had estimated 258 pairs, which Pembrokeshire did quite well. There have been more recent surveys done in Ireland, which pushed that population up to about 912 there now. And there's also been some reintroductions to Jersey and Kent, very, very small numbers. But in England, the Cornish population, which was only about 9 pairs in 2014, had increased to about 50 pairs by 2024. So, things are looking up in that regard for choughs. I think if you look at this particular graph, it does show the trend. It's quite clear that chough population has been increasing. And if you put this is throughout Wales, I'm looking at here, but if you put Pembrokeshire into that sort of context, we reckon we've probably got about sometimes up to 30% of the population of the Welsh population in Pembrokeshire alone. It varies between sort of 25 to 30% on average between that period 63 to 2024. And just looking at the Pembrokeshire population of these same periods, you can see that between 1948 and 63, things look fairly stable, generally speaking. That may be under recording, it may just be due to the cold winters. But from 1971 onwards, the population started to shift upwards. And certainly in the last decade, it seems to have gone up even more. And since 1992, Jane Hodges, myself and Annie and others have been monitoring them in much more detailed way. And we can see from the number of successful pairs we can measure as well now, just as well as just breeding pairs, that that success has been increasing too. So it is a real increase that we're seeing. And if we just look at the Pembrokeshire population on its own here, but also compare the island's contribution to the county population, it is quite important. Between 1971 and 2024, we have fairly good data for the islands. That includes Ramsey, Skoma and Skocum, and also Coldy Island, which has got a chough population breeding too. Ramsey has the largest population, but collectively the islands account for around about somewhere between 20 and 25%. Generally speaking, almost a quarter of the population in the county. So a very important contribution they have.
There are quite a few important areas around the Pembrokeshire coast for choughs, but this one in particular is Ramsey Island, the sort of northwestern part of the county. Here, the island and also the nearby mainland is a real stronghold for choughs. It's an RSPB nature reserve here. Good numbers of sheep grazing, and also a good rabbit population, which benefits choughs considerably, as well as a breeding population of about 10 to 15 pairs. There is also a non-breeding flock that regularly occurs here, roosting on the island, but also the choughs from the island visit the mainland. And here we have Skoma in the distance. Skokum is just off screen, and the Marloes Peninsula. Very important place for choughs. The islands, of course, have a small breeding population, as does the Marloes Peninsula itself. And in addition, the young birds that are roaming around, particularly through the spring and through the autumn, gather in the Marloes Peninsula and generally.
Another important area, not an island, but the limestone coast along the Castlemartin Peninsula, which I know particularly well, is really good for choughs. Here on about 20 kilometres of limestone coastline, we have anywhere between 15 to 20 pairs of choughs breeding over the years, and where there's lots of crevices and quite good feeding habitat. The three areas I've just mentioned, Ramsey, St David's, Skoma, Skokum, and the Castlemartin coast, are, as I say, really important, and they're designated as special protection areas. In the case of the islands, of course, for the seabirds as much as anything, but also choughs too, because they support more than 1% of the European population. I think overall it's around about 2, 3, or maybe 4% of the population in each of those places. So I'm going to talk a bit more now about the birds in particular on the Castlemartin coast.
Let's talk about the Castlemartin Coast SPA. This is a very important area on the limestone, around about 20 kilometres of coast and cliffs. But for the most part, about 80% of the area is a military range, the Castlemartin Range, split into two kind of components. Range East, where you can actually go and walk along the coast path when they're not far. Range can be a really busy and quite noisy place. If anybody's actually been down in the evening on a Tuesday or a Thursday when they're doing night firing, it's quite a spectacle, like a firework display, basically, but rather noisy one. And you have to wonder, how do choughs cope with all the activity that's going out there? But for some, yeah, quite a noise these tanks make when they're firing. But this chuff doesn't seem to be too bothered about it, sitting on an old rusty hulk that's used for target practice, and another one perched on a sign telling us to keep out. You do have to wonder whether they know that sign's in place for their benefit. So if you've been to the Castlemartin Peninsula, there's a fair chance you may well have been to St Govan's Head. Here, there's a car park nearby. Also, two pairs of choughs are nesting along here, and fairly close together. And also for those of you who've got good eyesight, you may have spotted a little red pot on the cliff top there, which marks a climbing restriction marker, because it's a very important area for recreation activities, and climbing especially is very busy here in the summer. Climbers get briefed by the National Park Ranger who's employed here. So there's very good rapport with anybody doing recreational activities to make sure that the choughs and other birds, like seabirds, for example, do not get disturbed when they're breeding. And it works really well. These are voluntary restrictions, but they do work really well. Another component, an important component of the Castlemartin Range and the limestone coast in particular, is the fact that large numbers of sheep are there from around about just before Christmas through to the spring. These are sheep coming down from the Preseli Hills, a very important relationship between Preseli Hill farmers and the Castlemartin Range. And this has been going on for some years now, since the Second World War. Thousands of sheep on the area make it really good for choughs because they are grazing down the vegetation to a short sward height. Also, cattle graze there from time to time when it's possible. And choughs really benefit from this. It helps the soil invertebrates, helps the vegetation in general, and also it supports the breeding choughs because with all these sheep, there's quite a lot of wool to line the nest and make it a nice, warm, cozy place when they're breeding.
Of course, it's not all plain sailing for choughs, whether you're at Castle Martin or anywhere, because there's a threat to your survival. There's always something wanting to eat you, I guess. Peregrines in particular are notorious. They will go for choughs if they can. We have known several young being killed in one season, found in a peregrine nest. That happens. It's just nature. Ravens too will try and get their eggs. They're probably quite capable of getting into crevices on occasions to remove eggs and chicks. And if there were ground predators like rats or stoats or weasels, or even foxes possibly, they too could cause choughs problems. It's so important that the islands remain rat-free and basically ground mammal free for this very same reason. It's very, very important that we look after these places. But we can't do that on the mainland quite so easily. So the islands are in a unique situation to stop the ground predators at least. However, once choughs do fledge, young choughs fledge, quite a lot of them do seem to make it, on average about 83%. This is based on some ringing work that we've done in the past. So we know that they're quite capable of rearing young. But generally speaking, by the time they're sort of 18 months old, um, there are only about 35% of them left to reach that sort of age. And then it drops down to around about 25% by the time they've reached 30 months old in the third calendar year. And then it drops dramatically again to around about 18% have survived. This is based on colouring observations. And so by the time they get to the fourth calendar year, when they should be thinking about attempting to breed. So quite a large number of those chicks don't make it. But as I say, if they can survive, there's a good chance that some of them will reach, 10 years or more. We've had birds reach 21 years, in this case a male in 2016, and a female, sadly, that was still alive until only a matter of a couple of weeks ago, that she was found dead during a little cold snap that we had. So, they really have to work hard to survive.
Other threats that you might not perhaps think about quite so much could be to do with our climate issues. The Met Office, for example, I would say last year, 2024, was one of the wettest on record, certainly in South Wales and in Pembrokeshire. We had very, very wet spring, which didn't help choughs. It was also not very sunny and not very warm either, which didn't help the invertebrates like ants and bees, which of course choughs like. So that could have affected their food supply. So that sort of if that's the norm for the future, it doesn't sound quite so good for invertebrates or for choughs for that matter. And also on top of that, when modern farming practices are certainly changing, there's a lot more spraying going on. We see certainly on the coast bigger machines coming into fields here spraying a cereal crop. Yes, they may be dealing with fungus growth perhaps, or they may be dealing with pests of some sort. But if there's no food in a place like that, well, that's no good for choughs or other wildlife for that matter.
Well, we're getting close to the end of the talk now, and so let's just finish on a high note. Yeah, when Reverend Murray Matthew wrote his book back in 1894, he said the choughs bred all the way around from Tenby to Dinas, but we hadn't had any records from Tenby, breeding records from Tenby for, well, possibly since then. They've not been recorded. But so it's pleasing within the last few years that they've started to breed again on St. Catherine's Island, just off Tenby, and they've been supported very much by food resources they find on the nearby golf course, Tenby Golf Course. So that's a plus that birds are moving in the right direction. And Coldy too, with its sheep grazing, particularly the Sowie sheep that are on the western part of the island, and the national park I think are trying to help with the grazing over there. That's good news. And so maybe there's a good news story for the future for choughs in that part of South Pembrokeshire.
Here is the new chough site at St Catherine's Island, Tenby, which we hope will